situation in Slovenia.
Yeah, very good.
Okay. Spoštovane kolegice in kolegi, dobrodošli na dogodku Društva novinarjev Slovenije v sodelovanju s pisarno Evropskega parlamenta v Ljubljani, ki, kot veste, podpira različne akcije v okviru akcije Tokrat grem volit, .eu, in tudi ta pogovor z kolegom Petrom Müllerjem, dopisnikom revije Spiegel iz Bruslja, je del tega projekta, ki naj bi seveda pomagal tudi nam novinarjem razumeti, kako delujejo naši najbolj prepoznavni kolegi v Bruslju, kako poročajo Evropski uniji, kaj si mislijo o tem in seveda kakšen je njihov pogled tudi na aktualne in bodoče evropske probleme. Pogovor bo v celoti potekal v angleščini. Po začetnem delu bom seveda takoj prepustil tudi možnost vam, da kolegu zastavite vprašanja. Dogodek naj bi trajal tam nekje največ 2 uri, ker se mora potem kolega Müller vrniti nazaj v Bruselj. So now I'll switch from Slovenian, which is a very difficult language. Only 2 million people in the world are actually somehow managing to speak it. So thank you for coming. You came directly to Brussels. You go back to Brussels. So you're Peter Müller. What people of my generation know a certain Peter Müller from Switzerland because he was a very famous skier. Yes, but you're not the Peter Müller. You're the other Peter Müller, who is actually a rock star in Slovenia because of an article you wrote for Der Spiegel about the European Commission and President Juncker and his relationship to Mr. Plenković regarding the border dispute between Slovenia and Croatia. Well, could you tell us something about this story? Is it, let's say, a typical Brussels story you write as chief correspondent of Spiegel in the European capital?
Well, yeah, first of all, rockstar is very flattering, so no similarities there.
Okay, pop star.
Thanks for inviting me. And to be blunt, this dispute on Piran wouldn't have been a Spiegel story just because there's a dispute between Croatia and Slovenia. For me, it was a Spiegel story, also for readers, of course, in Germany, because it showed something, in my view, it showed something on how the European Commission, this European Commission, is conducting its business. So what we had there was simply a legal paper, a note in a way by legal experts in the Commission laying out arguments for why or why not the Commission should get into a legal dispute Slovenia has with Croatia in front of the European Court of Justice. It's a couple of pages, it's not much more. But on the other hand, of course, we have seen that the Commission didn't act on this paper, and we've been told that commissioners, people who actually run this body, haven't seen it. It's there, but the most senior politicians in Brussels were not allowed to have a look at it. And we knew that in the end of the day, the Commission didn't support Slovenia at the beginning of this lawsuit, despite the fact that this legal note clearly laid out that it should. And so this is why I thought it's an interesting story, and this is why the person actually who gave me this paper gave it to us.
Okay. You're a lawyer by yourself, because you studied at Harvard University, but not only law, but also political science and journalism. No, but you're a perfectly fit man to write about a lot of things. Well, you're now, as I said, the chief of bureau of Spiegel in Brussels. Before you were working in Berlin for the Spiegel. Before that for Handelsblatt, which is also very big newspaper, and Welt am Sonntag. So you have a lot of experience. About your expertise regarding the CSU, so the Bavarian Christian Social Union. We will talk a little bit later, but from your professional perspective, how is Brussels, if you compare it to other main cities, main political cities like Berlin or also Washington?
Well, I think Brussels is not your typical place for being a foreign correspondent. If you compare it, I obviously can't compare it to your country, but if I compare it to Berlin, the institutional setup is pretty much the same. So you have a parliament which is chatty, where it's quite easy to get contacts, where parliamentarians want to talk, want to give away with information, engage with journalists. They're really eager because there are not so many journalists asking them anything.
Yeah.
So it's easy.
So
and then
it's their initiative, I would say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have the executive side, so to say, in a way, the European Commission, which you could compare to ministries in a national setup, and that's much more difficult to get information. So civil servants keep information to themselves, and they're not so actively engaging with journalists. And I think from this perspective, from my point of view, the differences between Brussels and the national setup are not so huge. What is really different, what strikes me as really different from at least a German perspective, but I'm sure this is also true for your country, is that in Brussels, as a journalist, you're still expected to be not too critical on the European unification, on the European issues. So if you are criticizing, I don't know, a parliamentarian delegation to the Southern Caribbean for wasting money, it's very, very quick that you're an adversary of Europe if you make a story like this. And it would never happen I think it would never happen in a national kind of environment. And so this is something, either you're for us or against us. This Brussels of Jean-Claude Juncker, Elmar Brok, the German parliamentarian, old, sorry for saying this, old TV journalists who are not in business anymore, but have been for decades from Germany, hanging out with them, drinking in the evening. It was not only a Brussels bubble, it was a friendship. Either you're for us or against us. And if you're, in a way, not attacking, but if you're doing your job there, it's still not seen as totally normal. It's not everybody likes this.
Yeah, but it's actually a problem because, you know, checks and balances by journalists is extremely important to strengthen, let's say, institutions and also the whole idea. So I mean, what can we as journalists change when it comes to this notion of labeling reporters immediately pro and contra? What could we do against it?
Well, actually, it's not so easy, but I think one thing, and this is not a great insight, but one thing you could, of course, do, and probably you already do it also in this country, is that to a certain extent you see that what's happening in Brussels is just the extension of interior politics in this town, or in Berlin, or in Paris. So it's whatever is decided there immediately has an impact on politics in member states. And if you link this more closely, I think this already helps. This already gives you also the opportunity to reach many more readers or viewers or listeners than when you just concentrate on what's happening in Brussels. So this linking it back to your home country, I think, is very important.
Before we go to another issue, I just wanted to ask you, what it's the logistics which is quite striking in Brussels, because we have more than 700 parliamentarians eager to talk. Not everybody, but a lot of them. We have a lot of institutions. So how do you keep your overview? I mean, it's okay. We have a big parliament in Berlin, but not as big. In Washington, also the Congress is not as big as.
The main difference is not, I think, the size of the institutions. The main difference is that you don't have the people on the ground to cover them. So, I mean, if you look at the Spiegel in Berlin, together with our webpage, in the bureau, in the Berlin bureau, I think we have 40 or 50 journalists. Maybe it's a bit too much, maybe it's only 35, but it's a huge operation, right? And if you look in Brussels, we are 3, sometimes only 2. And so this makes getting an overview essential. And I would also say, quite frankly, that we also fail. It's not possible. It's not even possible, and this is not complaining, it's just not even possible to keep track of your emails on certain days. Because everybody of these 700 parliamentarians thinks it's very essential that he sends out a press notice once a day. just to show that he's there, right? And so if you get 100 of them, maybe 2 or 3 are important and you don't see them. So I think most news outlets are not able to really, it's absolutely obvious. News outlets are not able to cover Brussels as intensively as it's possible in national capitals. And
should they do more? I mean, should they increase?
You should increase, of course one should increase having people on the ground in Brussels, also because of what we said before. It's interior politics just at another location.
Before we go to your take on the upcoming European elections, well, you mentioned, this culture of labeling people pro and contrary, but fact is that there are a lot of, let's say, political forces on the rise in Europe which actually question the European Union. So how do you find this fine line between criticizing and writing about problems occurring also in Brussels and within the European Union and its structures, and of course reporting on, let's say, the outspoken adversaries of the present European idea?
That's actually, of course, as you can imagine, this is not easy for my colleagues and me in Brussels. But what is important, I think, is that you can't stop reporting on things which don't work well in Brussels just because you're afraid to be put in the wrong camp. I even would say that you are working in favor of the wrong camp if you stop bringing up legitimate criticism on Brussels problems. So if you look at a person in parliament who might not be re-elected from Germany, her name is Inge Gressle, she is in the Budget Control Committee. She has this debate with everything she does. She just has a small office, 3 or 4 people, tax lawyers, people like that, just trying to get a hold on how money is spent in the institutions. Of course, with 3 people you can't do much, but you can do different things. And whenever she comes up with something, tax fraud or regional subsidies not being spent as they should be, she immediately has this argument. So you're just playing for the ones of Matteo Salvini, Viktor Orban, or the PiS party, right? So, and I think that's just wrong. I think to keep these parties in check, the mainstream Europeans have to do our job and also bring up legitimate criticism by ourselves. Otherwise they do it. And then they have a point, which makes them even more dangerous.
Okay, is this a big issue in German journalism? Because now, for the first time, you have okay, I would put it quite boldly, right-wing party in your parliament. Is this fact actually making your life even more complicated as a journalist?
As I'm in Brussels since 3.5 years, and the AfD came into the German federal parliament later. So I'm not the best expert in commenting on what's going on in Berlin. From what I know from my colleagues, it changed a lot. And as you can imagine, also with social media, with things going on in Facebook, Twitter, with the immediate reaction time on things developing, with the AfD, our right-wing party, being very savvy on using these tools. The normal parties are not, but they are. The work of journalists in Berlin, as in other capitals, I think changed dramatically. Yeah. Also, I mean, you're immediately taken to court now by these members of these parties as if a tiny thing in a tweet is not totally wrong, but not really totally right as well. And so it's increasingly, I would say it poisons the political atmosphere. At least it threatens to poison the political atmosphere also in Berlin now. And for us, compared to other European countries, this is relatively new. We didn't have this right-wing, extremist right-wing parties, at least not in a federal government, for 50 years. And now it's there, and I think it's a big change.
But they will probably, of course, come to the European Parliament now with the new elections.
They're already there. But
will this make your life as a journalist even more complicated also in Brussels?
I think so, but I think not to a huge extent, because this is maybe not so much true for me as a German, but if you look at my French colleagues, they of course have Le Pen's party there for a long time. You could even make the argument that Le Pen's party, without being in the European Parliament, wouldn't even exist, taking out all the subsidies they get from there. And so for them, also going back to this argument, Brussels politics is interior politics, for them this was always natural to have a very good look at what's happening in the European Parliament with Le Pen, just because it's so dramatically important for French politics.
Okay, now I open the floor for our colleagues. If there are any questions for Peter regarding journalism, regarding Brussels, regarding the way of reporting. Mr. Merschol.
Well, I'm loud enough, thanks.
Very good.
Okay. Yeah. You need the mic, Mr. Merschol.
Okay. Well, very interesting introduction into explaining how the work of a journalist in Brussels looks like. But nevertheless, I would like to ask you how really, and it's a kind of general question, how really is Brussels policy perceived by journalists, by reporters from member countries? Namely, I have a feeling that because Brussels is still being looked as a sort of foreign political center, not domestic political center. And is it possible that the way of reporting, the style of reporting, should change a little bit in order to transfer a kind of foreign policy reporting into domestic policy reporting? Because I think that it's being perceived among the readers or viewers in any member country is that something coming from Brussels is a foreign policy, it's a foreign policy order or dictate or whatever, it's not your domestic policy.
Which is of course ridiculous, as your politicians from this country, as my politicians from Germany, have agreed to everything which is decided in Brussels in the end of the day. No, I think that's an important point, and I just can say how we try to work with this at Der Spiegel. I'm part of the Berlin bureau. I mean, I'm the guy in Brussels and the office chief there, but I'm not with the foreign desk in Hamburg, but I'm part of the Berlin bureau. And I think this is the right setup for covering Brussels. It's not without being questioned in Der Spiegel. So there are people who say this is wrong. We should have it with the foreign desk, because in Brussels, obviously, there are other topics being discussed than just topics which affect Germany. But I think it's right, as I said, because it's so much more important what's happening in Brussels now for what's happening in Germany or in other capitals than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And I would also say that you could change the perception of Brussels with your style of how you do your job. And for the Spiegel, I think, I'm not totally sure of all, for the Spiegel, at least my predecessor, who was a very good journalist who came to Brussels, was in Tel Aviv before, the journalist for Israel and the Middle East. I came from Berlin. So this changed, of course, the style of reporting. So I do in Brussels what I always did in Berlin and what my colleagues of Der Spiegel always do in Berlin. We try to look behind closed doors. We try to find out what's happening in an environment where journalists shouldn't be. We try to, not overdoing it, but we try to find out what's happening in secret meetings. We try to understand what's being said at the cabinet table of Miss Merkel or in secret party meetings. And you can bring this to Brussels. I mean, it's easy. It's a kind of unique selling point still if you do this. If you try to find out, I don't know, when Mr. Weber, the chief party guy of the EPP, meets with Juncker, what have they been talking about? What are the issues? Or there are so many closed circles in Brussels where there are lots of people in there whom you could ask what happened. And there are stories. And funny enough, I think it makes it much more interesting for the reader. But funny enough, Brussels isn't used to that. Brussels is, this is also really a contradictory thing about Brussels, but this is very true. As we said, the parliament is really asking for journalists to report. They are craving for people being interested in what they're doing because nobody is. On the other hand, if you do this, yeah, and if you write about what's happening in the EPP group meeting discussing Orban last Wednesday evening, you're in trouble as well, because this is, again, not the kind of reporting they want to have, right? So, but that's exactly, if you do this, I think it's much more interesting for back home. Brussels has, of course, one big problem, and this cannot be overcome by 1 or 2 or 3 or even 100 journalists. People in Slovenia might just not know people doing politics in Brussels. People in Berlin are not familiar even with the guy who is running for socialists in the European campaign, Franz Timmermans. Who is this? Never heard of him. Even our guy, Manfred Weber, is not our guy, meaning the German guy, Manfred Weber, is not well known in Germany. People in Bavaria don't know the guy. Yeah, so this, of course, then makes it difficult, last sentence for you as a journalist, to go to your editor and say, hey, I have a great story on Manfred Weber. And if you come with Timmermans, you know, it's just, that's really difficult. But I think this is the right way, to cover it as you would cover domestic politics here. Yeah, that would be my answer.
Next question. Yeah.
I was just listening to your answer, and maybe it's easier for you because you are a magazine. So all the other media already are reporting on this, you know, boring stuff like directives, Brexit, you know, these official meetings, blah, blah, blah. I think that for Slovenia, the pity is that we are just getting this sort of reporting, just the official stuff. We are really not getting this really insight, or maybe this story that you are now talking about. At least maybe I'm wrong. Maybe maybe we have one good emission on public television, very good, Globus. They go behind the scene. But more or less, I think that, no, and it's a pity. I think that we in Slovenia are getting a lot of this, you know, boring Brussels that is not really interesting and very technical Brussels.
But, I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't want to discredit any colleague who does this kind of reporting, because it is important. I mean, when you say boring directives, I totally would agree. It's boring, but it's so important. And eventually, boring directives can bring people to the thousands on the street, maybe like we've just seen with the climate march here, the first in this town. If you look at this copyright directive, which is being discussed in European Parliament at the moment, the discussion on, I'm not an expert there, but the discussion on upload filters of the freedom of the internet. I mean, this is a very technical issue. I couldn't dream of reporting in depth, but and I envy every journalist who can do that, but it's very important and it's very emotional, and it might well be that this topic is more decisive for the European elections than some of the topics we could easily all talk about. So I'm not want to downgrade journalists who are able, with a lot of knowledge, to report on this. But I think a topic like the copyright reform is a rare exception, where a complicated thing can bring thousands to the streets. This will not happen to the new gas directive or something like that. And of course, journalists in Brussels from all countries don't have time to, if you have to write 3 stories for a news agency on new directives coming out of the Commission, you don't have time to think about how could I make this more interesting for people back home. This goes back to what I said, that still, I think all basically major outlets in Brussels are understaffed. It's just a lot of things happening, a lot of, as you said, technical things happening, which are very important, affect everyday lives of people, but which you can't deal with in the same kind of way you would be able to do this when you're reporting from your own home country. That's like that, yeah.
Okay. Do we have another question? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Maja. I work for Public Radio, Slovenia. Do you think that this parliamentary EU election, that it will be hijacked by themes like extremists, the rise of populist groups in the parliament? Yeah. Because for example, where I work, there are two teams of editors. Some editors maintain that we should ask questions like the future of EU and the rise of populism, and there are others who profess asking questions about consumer rights issues like, I don't know, digital market, plastic bags, how the EU affects you in everyday life.
Well, I think you should, if I might say that, you could of course do both, but if you ask me what will be the narrative of this election, it will be the first thing you said, of course. It will not be about topics, it will be not be about the topics like the plastic directive and things like that. It will be about the rise of populism. It will be, you can also put Brexit into this respect. That of course also has to do with populists. It will be about the question if the European Parliament will still be functioning well after these elections, if it comes to a realignment of populist forces. I think you already, despite the fact that these elections are still a long time away in recent standards, when you look at campaigning, you do it 2 or 3 weeks before, but still you see a certain outline of, if you see how somebody like Macron is tackling this issue, and if you compare it, for instance, to Weber, the EPP guy, it's quite interesting. So Macron basically says it's me or them. So it's me or Orban, to make it very easy. And you can of course do this, but if you frame an election like this, there is no space for everything you just mentioned as the second point, the directives, the topics, the material kind of substance you could discuss on European things. And so people are questioning, not only in Brussels, if this is the right setup, the Macron setup, it's either me or the populists. But in the end of the day, I know that Weber wants to do his campaign differently, but in the end of the day, I think that this Macron way will prevail, because it's just, I'm not even sure it's wrong, it's just simple. It's something which you can easily transmit in television, in magazines, in your reporting. It's a typical setup, if I might say, for a good story. You have a good guy and a bad guy, and you can just tell your stories along these lines. And I think this will be the setup of the elections, the Macron style. It's either, my words now, the good democratic friends of Europe, or it's Salvini, Orban, or the others. Yeah, unfortunately, if I might say, because I think it's a bit too oversimplifying things.
Do you support the Spitzenkandidaten process as it is? For example, what if Weber becomes a candidate and then one who gets the equal amount of votes from, I don't know, Social Democratic Party? Yeah. What happens then?
I'm not so sure about the Spitzenkandidaten thing. I was actually very critical. Everybody knows what this is, right? That this lead candidate. Yeah, okay.
Suspicious word because it's German, Spitzenkandidat.
Yeah, but even if you were to ask in Germany, with the context of European elections, as I said, people wouldn't be so sure what this is about. So they vote for Merkel or I don't know, but not Europe. Okay. No, I think that I was very skeptical about this, and to a certain extent I still am, because it, of course, this Spitzenkandidaten thing tries to replicate, from what I know as the German model, to the European level. And it's no surprise that it was invented basically by Germans. So it was, in a way, an invention by Martin Schulz to improve his career. This is how the Spitzenkandidaten came into play. Having said this, and having been in Brussels now for 3 or 4, almost 4 years, and maybe being a bit infected by the Brussels bubble, I would say it doesn't, on the other hand, it doesn't hurt either. I mean, why does it hurt if you have this guy like Weber running around in Europe now and talking about European politics? Why does it hurt if you have Timmermans going to Budapest, meet with the Social Democrats there and do a speech and go to one of the last TV outlets who are not run by friends of Orban and do a 45 minutes interview? It's to call him Spitzenkandidat or not, but if we didn't have this process, this wouldn't happen. So I think in the end of the day, it's in the end of the day, at the beginning it was invented as a tool in a power game between the parliament, who wants to upgrade its power, and the council, the heads of states and government, who want to discuss who is the commission president behind the closed shop. And if you compare these two kinds of ideas, I think the Spitzenkandidaten thing can't hurt. Now, the interesting thing, of course, and this might be why you're asking, in this election is that in the end of the day, we don't know if the winner of the campaign will be the commission president. This is simply because the guy who will win the elections, Mr. Weber, has never worked in a ministry. He has not even been a mayor in some small town in Bavaria. He has had his whole career in parliament. And as of course you know, there are many heads of states of government who say, we are not sure if this is the guy who is strong enough to negotiate on car tariffs with Donald Trump, which in the end of the day Juncker did. And this is actually, I think, a risk of Weber's candidacy, that in the end that might actually kill this process, because if he's the winner of the election, if he gets a majority in parliament, big if, but if he gets it, and then he's rejected by the heads of states and government, then this is dead. This is not coming back. If it's repeated now as a second time, it will be there, I'm pretty sure. So this is a really make or break moment for this whole process. It will be interesting. Yeah.
Okay. Before coming to Weber, who you know extremely well because you studied the CSU party very closely and wrote a book about it. Just one thing I may rely on. I mean, in a way, this let's say European topics or big issues. It's quite interesting in Slovenia because, okay, this is my personal opinion. Just after Slovenia joining the EU in 2004, I mean, before Europe was of course a big issue here because we wanted desperately to join. But then I think the whole, I would say, social climate changed in a way that, okay, now we're in. Okay, in 2007 we adopted the euro, so we're fully in. We're core of Europe, and now we can focus once more on the small internal things. We can eat each other, you know, in a way. So Europe doesn't interest us because it's okay. Brussels is something to blame. I see from how we actually did reporting. So you know, European issues were not so interesting, and we're not actually so evident in our reporting. We actually somehow re-provincialized ourselves after joining the EU. But for example, with this issues like migration, common European policies in asylum, yes, for example, Greece, it actually brought the European topics back also to the Slovenian spotlight. So is it so bad that actually we have these big problems to tackle, and we know that we cannot tackle them by ourselves? We have to tackle them together.
Of course, it's obvious, I think, that certain topics in today's world you can't tackle alone again. I mean, if you talk to political scientists, they always make this claim, which I think is right, but it just sounds so overblown, that to have a say as a national state in globalization in these days, you have to work together. Otherwise, you just, as a European state, even not only Slovenia, even Germany, you don't have a say anymore in today's world with China and all the other big players. So the idea why working together is important is quite obvious. The problem is why, to put it bluntly, why don't most people understand it? Yeah, and of course, the things now you mentioned, where we have to work together, are all negative topics. So everybody explains the Greek crisis, of course, and of course that is right, I don't blame that, as a catastrophe for the Greek people. Yeah, austerity politics, Germany, the Bundestag cutting pensions in Athens, and things like that. And this is all to a certain extent true.
We did also our part, the Slovenians.
Yeah,
but okay.
Which you know better than I do. But it is all true. But you can, of course, also try to tell it. It's difficult, but you can tell it also as a bit of a success story. At least this crisis has been overcome. At least the countries which have gotten money, to put it simply, from Europe, from the different kind of new proposal scheme being set up, are out of the programs now. Look at Ireland, which is really booming at the moment. Spain is coming back, and the last countries now have left these kind of help programs. So, but nobody is telling this story, or at least not even trying to tell what is in mind of the Eurozone crisis is crisis. And of course it wasn't crisis, but it's also, and it might come back, it's not all solved. We didn't learn our lessons, but for the moment it's quiet, and nobody's telling this story. Take migrants. It's pretty much the same. And on the other hand, of course you're right, the migrant policies, the asylum policy, as you mentioned, it's not solved, right? Europe wasn't able to come up with a European migration scheme. Europe wasn't able to come up with a new Dublin kind of legislation. Interior ministers last week said, okay, we are not able after 3.5 years to find a solution. The next commission has to come up with new proposals. Now imagine to go with this into the European elections. Of course, if I was advising the AfD, they don't even need to have advice to kind of make something out of this. So yeah, I don't know. That doesn't really answer it, but
no, it's a sort of answer. Yeah, that's good. Next question. If not, yeah. Okay.
Could you perhaps share with us some concrete tips? How do you make a real story from the millions of halls in Brussels? What do you do that you're not just one of the journalists who is like a press officer of European Parliament, perhaps?
That's now. I think this. No, there's no. There's no Müller principle. No, this is. You just do the same thing you're doing in your national kind of environment. There's no. For the Spiegel, and this is true for all major outlets, I think you need. It's just naive. I'm really embarrassed to say that, but you have to make your story interesting. You have to have people who are interesting, and you have to find, in a way, you have to find an angle to a story which is attractive to readers back home in Hamburg or Bavaria, and you're totally right. For a magazine, this is much easier than for somebody who is in a daily reporting job, or even in a news agency who has to do 3 or 4 stories every day. But if you do just that, what you've learned in your national environment, this was in a way my point at the beginning. If you just transfer how you're doing your job in this town or in Paris or in Berlin to Brussels, this already would help a lot. If you just try to find out, now we have a German candidate who might become president of the commission. It would be the first guy since the 1950s. So this is a big thing. Not that it's very interesting to most of German readers, but it's still but it still is a big thing. So of course you now can go around and find out what's happening with this guy. What do other people think of him? Is there a kind of conspiracy, if I might say so, to prevent him after the elections? What do people in Eastern Europe think about a German candidate? Actually, what do the French think about a German candidate? Is it already true that Mr. Barnier, who is also quite well known as doing the Brexit thing, is he actually the guy who will then be the Commission president, and not the guy who is running around as a Spitzenkandidat nobody knows at the moment? So I think these are stories you can work on. I'm not saying that it's immediately attractive for readers in back home, but I think you can make them interesting. And sorry for not being more concrete, but I think it's the same then like you do your job here. If you do this in Brussels, then it's more than enough. But yeah, but then do it. Yeah. No.
Hi, Herr Müller. I'm Peter as well.
Very good.
My question builds upon the previous one. Mine is more stylistic. Whenever I read a Spiegel article, be it in original or in a translation, I know after 2 sentences, okay, this is a Spiegel article. Right? I don't have to look at the title.
Yeah.
It's almost like reading a novel at the start, like focusing on one character.
Touching on a very difficult subject almost there. But
Okay. So
Speaking of novels,
yeah,
but
no,
okay.
really it is like focusing on the character and then building,
think about it. I've
Yeah.
been warned. Yeah.
and then building and then extrapolating a bigger
Yeah.
story from that
Yeah.
character and his experiences. And I find that like when every author from the Spiegel, it's very similar, this kind of story building. So I would just like to maybe explain this. You know, have I read this correctly? Is this true, or you know, can you comment on that?
To be quite honest, I think it was true for almost all of our existence after the war. And what made the Spiegel in Germany famous was, and you're totally right, was this certain voice of storytelling, which of course came for many years with the fact that in the good old days, 60s, 70s, Der Spiegel was the place which had the information other news outlets didn't have. So if there was the presidency of the CDU party meeting in Bonn back then, on a Monday, you read about what happened in next week's Spiegel, week thereafter. So if you compare this to today, this has totally changed. You can read it, when I was in Berlin, which is 3 years ago, you could read it in next day's newspapers. If you were in Berlin now, you can read it real time in Twitter. Yeah, this also changes the way you tell stories, of course, right? So I think there was, and you're right with that, there was for a very long time a typical setup of a Spiegel story, which is starting novel style. You say you're starting with some kind of scenery where you take the reader and bring him to a place where he usually isn't. So he is sitting with you at the cabinet table of Miss Merkel. Of course, and I think this is good, as long as all the details are right, and usually they are. Yeah, but and as long, I would say, as you make clear, of course, that you were not there. Yeah, you at least just including the half sentence of people who were attending told Der Spiegel. This already, I think, is enough, but you have to make it clear that you reconstruct a scenery. But I think this is still a very important and I might say noble journalistic undertaking, which is really good, also important for democracy, that you look at meetings behind closed doors where politicians want to keep journalists out. And from there goes your story, I would say.
Thank you.
But you use that pika. I read your interview with Mr. Weber a fortnight ago. I mean, you really started with this way, you know, positioning him in a place in Bavaria. So you also stick to this tradition.
Yeah, but sure, but in this interview, it is obvious for the reader that we meet him somewhere. And it's you or me or my colleague sitting there, and there's a photographer, and it's coming back to what I said about Mr. Weber before, but it's true for many politicians. We thought to use this little bit of text at the start of the interview to introduce the guy, because he's not so well known. So why are we doing 3 pages with Mr. Weber 8 weeks before an election most people haven't heard about yet? So this was in a way the idea. What we've been discussing about is you know, sceneries where you were not as a journalist, and you try to explain what has been happening there.
Okay. Well, speaking about Mr. Weber, if there are no questions. Yeah, sorry.
How do you see European Union without Mrs. Angela Merkel?
This is, yeah.
It will be a long answer, I would say. Do you have time?
I don't even know if I have a good answer. The point is, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe we're already seeing it. I would say, of course, there's always with other heads of states and government, there's always a big respect whenever Merkel comes, if you like her or not, or her politics, but it's a big respect because she's been around for so long. So she's been around since 2005. This is a track record nobody else in the council at the moment has, and this is all, these 28 politicians are all alpha males or females. They all know the interior politics. They know how difficult it is to stay.
There are some exceptions, I would say.
Yeah, but they know how difficult it is to stay at the top of politics in your home country, and they tend to admire somebody who's been able to stick around for 15 years. The next guy actually is Rutte, who has been there for 10 years now as well, the Dutch prime minister. So, but if you discount that, there's actually not so much coming anymore from Germany. There's no impulses on European politics. There is no Merkel kind of plan for Europe. There's no Merkel answer on anything Macron has been saying. There's no positive, that might be too negative now, but I think it's true. There's no positive German agenda what we want to do with this European Union. To give her credit, to give Merkel credit, she has been in a crisis modus for almost all of her tenure. And these crises always came from Europe, like the Eurozone, the financial crisis before, and the migrants. So, but she never came up with a plan for Europe. So I'm not sure if she as a person, if she's not there anymore, changes so much. Maybe I'm totally wrong, I'm just thinking. But the bigger question is, if Germany keeps absent after the Brits go out, what does that change? Keeps absent as it is now, right? There is, as I said, there is no, you can think about Macron whatever you want, but you put a plan on the table. You can think about a plan whatever you want, but at least you have to give the guy credit. He goes out there, he talks to farmers, he talks to the yellow vests and defends Europe. And I've been there visiting some of the things he does, and it's impressive, I have to say. Whatever you think of the content, and there's nobody does that in Germany. I don't know how it's here, it's nobody. And so I think, yeah, to repeat myself, I think I'm not so sure if Merkel will be so much missed, but Germany as a big country has to come up with some ideas on how to deal, what to do with Europe.
But Europe without angel is Europe full of devils. Then.
Say again?
Europe without an angel.
Yeah. Oh, only devils, yeah. Okay, maybe. Yeah.
Sorry about that, Igor.
No.
I'm interested in fact-checking because I will be doing it myself. So how many fact-checkers do you have at Spiegel? How fast do they work? Does every article you write go through them? And how come they overlook that guy from Spiegel who fabricated
We don't even
stories?
mention this name here.
No.
I was promised this question comes to the end, but so this is a broken promise now. That's okay. You're not to be blamed. No problem. I'm more than happy to answer it. I'm just saying as a disclaimer, if I get some figures wrong and you need that for reporting, go to the head office, right? No. I'm just saying if you, it's legitimate, of course. I think we have around 90 people doing fact checking. I'm not sure.
90.
90.
Okay.
90. Yeah, maybe it's wrong, 10 more or 10 less, but I think this is around it.
Still a lot.
It's a lot, and still they do not do fact-checking on every product the Spiegel is putting out. So I think, and this is difficult terrain because I don't know it totally, but I think it's right to say that every article in the magazine is fact-checked. Right? So we can talk about it in detail then what went wrong, but every article is. This is true for most print products the Spiegel has. We have fact checkers for our online edition, of course, but not, I would say, and every article is read there, but I'm pretty sure, of course, just due to time constraints, it's not the same fact checking than with the magazine, but nobody ever claimed that. So the fact checking is principally there for the print magazine. And also for, special magazines like Spiegel History or things like that. In earlier times, they did also fact-checking on books their Spiegel put out. I think this is not happening anymore due to money constraints and things. But so, and what are they doing? Well, basically, and we can of course then talk about what went wrong with this Relotius case. Basically, they ask you questions. So you write your article, you hand it into your editors. They think it's good or not, they change things or not, and then it goes to fact-checking, and then you have your session in person if you're in Hamburg, journalist, or on the phone in Brussels or Berlin, and you talk about, in a way, every line in this article. And I just told also you just before we came here, just to make an example. Yesterday was our deadline for the magazine, Thursday night, which is then published tonight online and tomorrow in the print edition. I did a little story on, again, Weber visiting Orban in Budapest on Tuesday. I was there. And he visited a synagogue after the meeting with Orban. And he was chatting with a guy who was, I've been told, the chief rabbi. And so the fact checker said, well, was it the chief rabbi? Because I read the chief rabbi in Budapest had resigned. So I don't know. I asked somebody, he was the chief rabbi, I had the name, okay, but I still have it here, he had resigned. So in the end of the day, the guy called the Jewish community in Budapest and got the confirmation. The guy resigned as the chief rabbi of the Hungarian community, but he's still there for the synagogue. And he, of course, also then got confirmation that the whole scenery was there, that Weber was there, that they were talking about architect, about the synagogue, Jewish life, and so. So this is how it should be, right? Is it like this all the time? Of course not. I mean, it's also an operation under time constraints, right? But I think, and this is, and you have to ask, and if you want to know more about it, I think it also comes down, fact-checking is easy when you want to check the things like the distance of this town to Brussels. So, yeah. Is it easy it's much more difficult if you have a reporter being out with some weird Americans at the Mexican borders who want to stop migrants there, who are people who are not wanting to be seen on television. You have no photographer with you because you can't do your story if you have a photographer. What can a fact checker do then? He basically has to trust the guy. And this is what went wrong. Right? To put it the other way around, if you want to cheat as a journalist in this system, I think it's entirely possible. Yeah, and this is, I think, what happened.
But you have to be a very good cheater then.
Yeah, and this guy was.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not familiar with all the nitty-gritty and details of how he did that. But if you talk to people who worked with him, these are, of course, smart people. No. I mean, they're journalists like all of us, and they're not people who believe everything just because a guy says it, right? Mm. But there were fake emails, there were fake email accounts, there was so much energy invested in making up the backgrounds for a story. This is even more energy on this than writing the actual story. Then in the end of the day, I'm not saying there were no mistakes. Of course there were mistakes on the Spiegel side, but it's in the end of the day, I think it's possible to just cheat in the system. Mm. Yeah. But ask more concrete things if you want to know, because I don't want to keep...
Well, definitely the guy could make a big career in politics, because, for example, we remember a certain guy named Boris Johnson who was also in the Brussels press corps, and he actually cheated quite well. Well, not so well. But
he made up stories, basically.
Yes, he made up stories, and then he made up stories in politics.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good example.
Are you getting any sanctions if your fact-checking people are saying, this and these journalists made such and such mistakes often, because Sorry. So, is there any feedback from your fact checkers to the editors, or how does it work?
No, I don't. It's not, even working at Der Spiegel is not working with sanctions, no. No. First of all, we are colleagues. Fact checkers are colleagues of the normal journalists, and they're working together with us. Many of them actually are journalists, or they're historians, or they have a doctorate somewhere, were in academia before, whatever. They're also becoming colleagues more and more because of this new kind of thing. I have no idea about data journalism, like processing huge amounts of data with some offshore leaks kind of investigative stories. This is often now also done with the help of fact checkers by Der Spiegel. So it's not that they are only these people starting to come into a story once the journalist has finished his or her job. But in the end of the day, it's, of course, if some journalist always makes mistakes and deliberate mistakes, I mean, everybody makes mistakes, right? Then you get a certain reputation in an organization. I mean, this is sure, this is clear, this is like everywhere. So, and of course, people chat in the cafeteria or when having lunch oh, I have to do the article of this guy this afternoon, I just can write it myself, right? Because it's so wrong, or things like that. I'm sure there's gossip like that, right? And it's totally okay or normal, but it's not that there's a sanction system, no. And I have to say, for me, myself, fact-checking helped a lot. Again, we had, as you mentioned it, this Weber interview, they had the guy wrong, if I might say this. He was he was saying Orban is getting more and more and more like Kaczynski. And they had the first name wrong. So it was the dead Kaczynski who went down with the plane. I didn't see that, the Weber people didn't see it, but our fact checkers did see that. And it's good to have them. It's even good for Weber to have them. Comparing Orban to a dead guy might not be the most intelligent thing doing now. So
it would be quite Orban-like. But,
that's nicely put. Yeah. But I'm just saying I'm happy that we have them, right? So.
But it's really incredibly high standards you have. So that's why it's also. I mean, if you fall from big height, then it hurts, of course.
It hurts, yeah.
So. Yeah. Okay. Next question. If not, I would ask you something about Weber. Now, as I mentioned, you made a big interview. You're reporting quite a lot because he's quite busy now with this Spitzenkandidat thing. But I mean, you said he's quite unknown in Germany, but of course he comes from a party which is quite notorious. You wrote a book about it. It was quite a successful book. Okay, in the meantime, much changed. But I mean, this work of you with the CSU, how does it get in your career? Because you were in Berlin. Before you were, as I said, at Welt am Sonntag. Why did you choose this?
The good thing with the CSU is, as you know, it's the smaller Bavarian sister party of Merkel's, or no, not Merkel's, Kramp-Karrenbauer's bigger party. And the CSU always has to be visible. They always have to punch a bit above their weight. If you look at...
Because they're Bavarians.
Exactly, and because they're small in the end of the day. If you look, if you compare them to the whole of Germany, they're a small party, right? If you, they might have had 50% of the vote in Bavaria, but if you translate this into Germany, it's 6%. It's smaller than the liberals, maybe even. So they have to punch above their weight, and so it's interesting to just engage with them in Berlin. For instance, if you write about a meeting between the party leader of the CSU and Ms. Merkel, you can write about this with quite some details, or the text messages he sends her. But of course, the source is also clear. Right, it's not Miss Merkel who's telling something. But still, it's true. It's things, and this is, I think, what I liked about the CSU is that that the people, their politicians, when in power in Berlin, give you access to insights other politicians wouldn't give you, quite frankly. And if you have a good relationship with them, not uncritical, of course not. The Spiegel will never be without criticism of the Bavarian CSU. This is our DNA. If you look at the history with Franz Josef Strauss, but still, if you find a working relationship with them, I think it's like working with politicians should be. You should be able to talk with the politicians like we are talking, without people watching, talking about privileged information, but then you're free to write whatever you want. You don't have to say thank you in your article and be nice to them. And whatever you think about the CSU, this is very special now, of course, for this, sorry for that, but whatever you think about them, they know how to take criticism. They will not come back in the next week and say, we didn't like the article. This Brussels thing doesn't happen there. And I like that a lot.
Well, because before you started with your last part, I thought, you know, it sounds quite Slovenian, because you know that it was actually the Bavarians who christened the Slovenians, so they're to blame for everything. But that was 1200 years ago. So I would say that the mentality of the Bavarians is quite related to the one which is predominant in Slovenia, which is no surprise because of the joint history. But this is really different. I mean, that they react in a way they react. So from this perspective, is Weber, let's say, a typically CSU type of politician?
He's not, and I think this is what makes it interesting. He's not in that respect that simply he's pro-European, right? The CSU never was.
Okay.
CSU always was a party who was very happy to blame Brussels for everything, very traditional style.
That's really Slovenian, yeah.
Yeah, that's probably true for most countries in Europe. But so he is different there. He's a guy, I think, who is, and this sounds maybe naive, but I still think it's true, who is more interested in finding political solutions than in a quick headline. This, of course, has the problem that but he's not as well known as others are, right? He always was, with his views, a minority in his party. The fact that his party lost so badly in the last couple of elections because people did not think it was a good idea to always attack Merkel on refugees, despite the fact that they might have been right on certain points. The CSU people didn't like them attacking the Chancellor. This, in a way, brought Weber in a very good position now, because this whole style of politics, this compromise, Brussels, compromising, looking for solutions, in a way, this is now very much en vogue in the CSU as well. If this is a successful way for them, that remains to be seen, but it helps him a lot at the moment, I think.
Okay. Any questions? No. If not, okay, speaking of Bavaria is almost speaking about Slovenia, although Slovenia is Bavaria without BMW, without Bayern München, without late Franz Josef Strauss, and a lot of other things. We have, of course, a bunch of C, Bavaria does not have. So it's different, but you told me that you actually don't know a lot about Slovenia. What do you know? I mean, from your Brussels perspective.
From my Brussels perspective, almost nothing, to be honest.
Okay.
I don't want to pretend here anything.
So Slovenia is actually not present enough in this.
Yeah, but who is? I mean, if you look, we have a 1 hour conversation till now here, and we didn't mention, both of us didn't mention, and nobody in the audience did mention Brexit. Interesting. Why would you ask anybody in Slovenia about Brexit? So can you blame Slovenians in Brussels now that they are not so much in the headlines this day? I don't think. It might be funny now. The only Slovenian politician in parliament I know is Alois Peterle, right? And this also only because he had some kind of initiative protecting bees. I found
because he's Slovenian
funny
and we
enough,
like bees.
So yeah, exactly. So this is why I met him. Also because he ran, of course, for becoming the president of parliament, but it was very clear that he had no chance. Maybe also because he was from a small country. Not being able to get a big coalition behind him. So I think, and this is, I really think this is honest, I think this is not a Slovenian problem whatsoever. It's difficult for small countries to have a big impact in Brussels. And this is something, I think, and there we come to the only Slovenian thing I've ever wrote about, this book, or this Piran thing. This is why it's important for us, and this is really important. It's important for small countries like Slovenia that the Commission works impartial and works in a way they can trust. Because if that's not true, nobody else will. I mean, in the Council, you have France, you have Italy, you have Germany, you had the Brits. They know how to push through their interests. And of course, now you see that it's very interesting to see a middleweight country, so to say, like the Netherlands, dramatically stepping up their diplomatic efforts in Brussels, because they see that the Brits, who have a different, who had the same view on economics, on politics, will leave. So they have to do it for themselves. But for small countries, it's really difficult, and they need the Commission as an impartial body implementing European law. And I think this is why the person who then gave us this paper was so angry about it. And this is how the story came about. And this has nothing to, this could have been another country. This is not typical Slovenian, not at all.
Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
To be journalists, we should also deal with the latest news, of course. and the latest news coming from New Zealand. And I just wonder, how is this massacre going to affect the sort of general populistic discussions which have been going on, either in Brussels or elsewhere, Paris and so on, about migration, refugee policy and so on? How much is it going to affect the opposites? To have the opposite effect? Because what I heard on the CNN, in Washington, people are already attacking Trump and his migration policy.
Yeah, I mean, of course you can now make the argument, and rightly so, that always blaming migrants, always attacking migrants, that politicians who just fuel this hatred have to stop now, right? It's another example of how this increasing hatred with migrants is causing horrible crimes and big damage. But not wanting to sound too cynical, I think, and sorry for this, but I think this New Zealand is a big topic today, maybe tomorrow, and then it's gone. I'm sorry for that, but that's, I mean, look at how, I'm not a very savvy guy on social media, but what strikes me always as interesting, and I don't like it, is, and this again sounds cynical, it's not meant to be, as soon as there's a bomb attack somewhere in Europe, you have these hashtags, Berlin attacks, Strasbourg attacks, and everybody's very sad, and it's a catastrophe, and then we forget about it. I mean, that's the truth, right? And so I think this migrant debate in Europe is poisoned. It is, and it will remain like that as long as a guy like Salvini, who is not a fringe guy, but a Minister of Interior for one of the big European countries, talks about migrants as, I don't know if it's the right word, but human waste or something. As long as if you have a discourse like that in the European public, things like that in New Zealand are more likely to happen, I think.
Okay, because this event is organized by the Journalistic Union of Slovenia. How do you see your profession? I mean, you're working for a fantastic outlet, are of course fantastically fit for doing it because of your education and your track record so far. So where do you see the biggest challenges of journalism in time of social media, in time of this instant flow of information, in time of artificial intelligence, data mining, and of course, in this climate of, let's say, everyday's hysteria? You know, today New Zealand, tomorrow who knows what, and you know, how do you see your role? These
are all good points and good questions, but way above actually my pay grade to answer. What I think. What I really think I would love to talk about is, and this is quite honest, that of course the economic basis of what we're doing, I don't know about here, but at least in the countries I know about, the economic basis for good journalism is just eroding. It's just going away. I mean, Der Spiegel is a big outlet, as you say, but it's also losing subscribers, thousands of them each year. And so this is happening everywhere. Even big television stations in Germany are threatened now because people don't watch public television anymore, but on the internet. There are more and more small town papers closing just because, not so much, but still they're closing just because people are not subscribing to newspapers anymore. Even if you think about it, and I think we can talk about this in a place like this or an event like this, even if you think about it, being a journalist, going as a young person into the career as a journalist, is this something you would nowadays recommend to your kids? I mean, it's a great job, but would you really say this? I mean, it's not about working hours, because we all love what we're doing and it's interesting, but it's about also simply what you earn, what the potential is to do this job for a lifetime. And I think this economic basis eroding is really, in the end of the day, when small towns papers close. Look at the United States, where it's whole US states without any local news outlets, then it sounds so big, but I think it's true that then step by step also democracy dies. And I think this is, everything you said is it's very relevant, but for me this is really something I think about, because of course you think about this also because it affects your own life, but it's really dangerous. And to make it very simple, if we don't find a way to be able to earn money in the internet, then this is something, at least 90 fact checkers with the Spiegel, you can't pay them with continuing the subscriptions going down. So in the end of the day, one has to find a way to earn money apart from print paper outlets.
You have any ideas you would share with us?
No, I think, no, I have no, but we started to ask for, at the Spiegel, at our online edition, we started a thing called Spiegel Plus, which simply is a kind of subscribers model. You pay 20 euros a month and then you get the whole magazine or whatever and everything which is available online. If you pay 5 euros more, we send you the paper as well, the magazine. And this works quite well, which is encouraging. So if people, at least in Germany, are willing without questioning to pay for Netflix 15 euros a month, and once you subscribe you don't even see it anymore, that you're paying it, of course, we should be able, and not that it doesn't have to be Der Spiegel, it can be Süddeutsche, FAZ, everybody, we should be able to get this business model translated into journalism, I think. I'm not saying that this is without any chance for success, but we are really late, I would say, as journalists to come up to tackle this kind of thing.
Okay. Last possibility to question. I might remind you there are no stupid questions, there are only stupid answers. This is what I was being told because I'm asking questions in television, so no stupid questions at all.
So hi again. Now to touch upon... Oh, sorry. This one?
Yeah. Thank God only the mic is dead. I'll give you mine.
Works now?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Now to touch upon the topic of dying newspapers, I think it's important to say that Slovenia is a small country. We're kind of like the Midwest of America, right? Like, no, you're too nice to say
Midwest is
beforehand,
bigger,
but we all
Smaller, but
yeah. In any case, of course, our newspapers are like the local newspapers. They're very important for our local environment. But it's really important to have larger newspapers present here in Slovenia, like Der Spiegel. So I would just like to stress that the importance that your and similar newspapers have in, let's say, the periphery of Europe is incredible. So please don't stop shipping your paper to us, because I was heartbroken when Geo-Epoche stopped being shipped here.
Which paper was stopped?
Geo-Epoche.
Okay, the Geo-Epoche. Okay,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah, I was heartbroken, so please don't stop shipping Spiegel.
I will tell them in Hamburg. How much does the Spiegel cost here?
It's €5.20, something like that.
That's okay. That's like back home.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay. Yeah. I tell them.
Thank you.
No, but still, I mean, it's you can have it digitally. I mean, it's
But it's not the same.
That's what I would say, but
I wouldn't agree. I mean, it's even more practical to have all the newspapers with you on a tablet.
What I sometimes hear, not only from Slovenia, what I sometimes hear, and this is also not only true for the Spiegel, but for other papers you mentioned, but that it helps when a Slovenian or a Czech story is being published in the Guardian or Der Spiegel or Süddeutsche Zeitung, because then sometimes politicians have to react in these smaller countries. So for me, that happened when I did a story in Der Spiegel. I'm just not very proud on this. It's just because I know the story, because I wrote it, on the way Babiš, the prime minister in the Czech Republic, used his company. He's the owner of Agrofair, which is one of the biggest agro companies in Europe. He used his company to get subsidies from Brussels, right, regional aid. And it's of course he was financed finance minister at the time, and it's an interesting setup that you're boss of one of the biggest companies, finance ministers who's controlling subsidies from Brussels, and your company is getting almost most of the subsidies coming from Brussels. And this was not a news story. I mean, we talked also a lot with Czech journalists about it, with sources in Prague. But when we reported it in Der Spiegel, it really brought a discussion into the Czech Republic. And that, for me, as I was relatively new in Brussels back then, showed me that we have some kind of responsibility there as well. And it's not, as I said, only for Der Spiegel. That can be the Guardian. Might be even better as an English language outlet for that. But yeah, I understand that. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think that because it's also a problem that of course, with this huge amount of information flowing around and focusing on so many things, and of course, each day is something happening which is really hijacking the day, like today, for obvious reasons, of course, the thing in Christchurch. But it's so difficult that information from smaller countries really get into big newspaper. Do you think that this may change, or do you think that for example, on editorial level, things may change? Because that was quite obvious that big newspapers actually focus themselves on big stories from the big world and neglecting a little bit, let's say, the peripheria we belong to.
To be frank, I don't think that will be easy. But on the other hand, it's in our hands as journalists. So of course, the Babiš thing is important for the Czech Republic, but it becomes important for German readership in this respect, because you can show it as an example of how badly European taxpayers' money is being monitored when being spent in other countries. And there you have a German angle. The thing I wrote on the dispute between Slovenia and Croatia in itself, without being disrespectful, would not have made it into the magazine if it was not a good example of how the European Commission is actually doing or not doing its job. And so you can use the example to show an even bigger point, and then it's possible to do this kind of reporting. But I'm just saying it will not come automatically.
Okay. Last question. Beg your pardon?
Last stupid question.
Last question. We could take more stupid questions afterwards.
No.
Yeah, it's working, yeah.
When you were talking about this, how to put a story about a small country into very important media and so on, I remember that how important it was that communication among journalists or foreign reporters among themselves was of a crucial importance. Because, for example, when I was in New York and Yugoslavia was falling apart and Slovenia was becoming independent, 1,100 foreign correspondents which were working together in the Foreign Press Association were always asking questions about Yugoslavia, about Slovenia, and so on and so on. And the stories would come from them back to the countries that they were coming from, you know. Nowadays, how much of communication is among, for example, among journalists in Brussels?
Yeah.
In what way? Spontaneous or organized?
That's a good question, because I think Brussels really is a good place to work. There's a lot of communications, and of course, if you have a question on the latest Spanish government falling apart, you go to your Spanish colleague and ask them, of course. And Brussels, in this respect, this has good side and bad sides. The bad sides I tried a bit to explain. Brussels is less competitive among journalists as Berlin is, as probably, of course, Paris is, or places London. So it's not that as you cater in a way to different audiences, you're not competitors that much than in a national environment. So I have no problem if my colleague from The Guardian has an exclusive story in Great Britain. Why would I care? But I would have a problem if somebody of FAZ in Germany has a story I could have had. And that makes you actually more prone to working together in foreign, not only in Brussels, in all foreign locations. And I think this is a good thing. Now, on the other hand, of course, there has to be obviously a reason to go to your colleague and ask. So if nothing was happening with Mr. Orban in Hungary, nobody would write about it, and there would be no need to, discuss with your colleagues there. So it's always both sides. But I think you're totally right, and Brussels here is a bit like the other posts abroad. It's much more a collegial way of working among journalists than in a national environment, I would say so. Yeah.
So to make Slovenia great again, I mean in news, then we should get independent again.
Yes.
Suggestion. Okay, so if there are no more questions, then thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Müller.
Thanks for having me.
Enjoy a trip back to Brussels, but do visit Slovenia again. I mean, the Bay of Piran is so beautiful, and
Yeah, I'm still waiting for this offer of the tourism office there to, go into this disputed
you should
waters.
fact check from both sides of the bay.
Exactly.
So that would be a good start to learn Slovenia better. Hopefully, we will be in good news, not bad news, and we wish you really good luck in your work, and we will monitor you anyway by reading the Spiegel. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.